All right, today we're going to crack open one of the most famous and infamous books on power ever written, Machiavelli's The Prince. This isn't just some old dusty book, it's a leader's survival guide. And its core message is pretty shocking. To do good, you might just have to learn how to be bad. So let's dive in and see what he really meant by that. And boom, right from the start, this quote just lays it all out. Machiavelli pulls no punches. He's basically telling us, hey, wake up. The world is a tough place and it's full of people who are not always playing by the rules. So, if you're a leader and you insist on being perfectly good all the time, you're not going to last. You're just setting yourself up to be ruined. So, what was his whole goal with this book? You know, he wasn't interested in talking about imaginary perfect kingdoms or flawless rulers. Machiavelli wanted to write something that was actually useful, a practical, real-world guide based on how things are, not how we wish they would be. You see, Machiavelli saw this massive, gaping canyon between our ideals, how we think people ought to act, and the messy reality of how they actually behave, which is, let's be honest, often driven by self-interest. And he believed that any leader who ignores that gap is absolutely doomed. Every piece of advice he gives is built on that one single, harsh truth. Okay, let's dig into one of his most surprising arguments. He takes a virtue that we all praise, generosity, and he flips it completely on its head. For a ruler, Machiavelli warns, this seemingly wonderful quality can actually be a fatal flaw. So he forces us to ask this really uncomfortable question. I mean, we're all taught that being generous is a good thing, a strength. But when you're talking about politics and power, is it really that simple? Well, Machiavelli's answer to that is a hard, resounding no. And here's the trap he lays out. He says, okay, to get a reputation for being generous, a ruler has to spend money like there's no tomorrow. But what happens when the treasury runs dry? Well, you have to raise taxes. And what does that do? It makes the people hate you. So the very thing you did to be loved, being generous, ends up making you despised. It's a complete downward spiral. And this is why, crazily enough, Machiavelli says the ruler who seems mean or miserly is actually in a way better position. Think about it. By being super careful with money, he doesn't have to overtax his people. He has enough money to defend the state, to fund his projects, and by leaving everyone's property alone, he's actually being more generous to the vast majority of people in the long run. Now, that same basic logic that avoiding the people's hatred is the #1 priority leads us to the most infamous piece of advice in the entire book. We've all heard it, right? For a ruler, it is much safer to be feared than to be loved. So what's the cold, hard logic behind this? Well, love, he says, is totally unreliable. It's this fragile bond of gratitude that people will snap in a heartbeat the moment it's in their own self-interest. You can't control it. Fear, on the other hand, fear is different. It's based on the dread of punishment, something that's always there. And, most importantly, it's an emotion that the ruler can control. But, and this is the key detail that everybody misses, he is not telling leaders to be tyrants. There is a huge critical difference between being feared and being hated. Fear keeps people in line. Hatred makes people want to rebel. So you can be feared for your power, but you must never, ever be hated for being greedy or unjust. And wow, this chilling quote just drives that point all the way home. Why is property so important? Because taking away someone's inheritance, their land, their money, it creates this deep-seated resentment that will never, ever go away. For Machiavelli, that's the ultimate red line a ruler must never cross. Okay, so if you're a ruler trying to navigate this incredibly dangerous world, what skills do you need? Well, Machiavelli gives us this brilliant and powerful metaphor. A leader has to learn to be both a lion and a fox. He explains that you've basically got two ways of getting things done. The first way is with laws. That's the human way. But because people aren't always good, laws alone are often not enough. So a leader has to learn to use the second way, force, the way of the beast. And this is where the two beasts come in. A ruler needs to be a lion, powerful and strong enough to scare off the wolves. But the lion, for all his strength, can be a little naive and walk right into a trap. So the ruler must also be a fox, who's cunning and clever enough to see those traps coming. You can't just be one. Strength without cunning is reckless, and cunning without strength is totally useless. You need both. And this is the ultimate fox move right here. If people were all good and honorable, he says, you should always keep your promises, but they're not.
And since other people will break their promises to you in a second, Machiavelli argues that a ruler can't be tied to his word when it puts the state in danger. It's a harsh idea, but from his point of view, it's just pragmatic.
So, let's pull all these threads together. What does this all add up to? The ultimate goal isn't just to be cruel or deceptive for the fun of it. Not at all. It's about one thing and one thing only: the survival and the stability of the state. So here it is, the Machiavellian playbook in a nutshell. First, your number one job is to keep the state safe. Second, do whatever it takes to avoid being hated. Third, on the outside, you need to seem like you have all the virtues. Be merciful, be faithful, all that good stuff. But fourth, behind the scenes, you have to know how and when to do evil if it's necessary. Because fifth, and this is the bottom line, in the end, you're only going to be judged by the result.
And that really leaves us with the big question, even 500 years later. Is The Prince just a cynical, evil guidebook for dictators? Or does it contain some uncomfortable, maybe even timeless truths about power that any leader in business, in politics, in any field really, needs to understand in order to survive and ultimately to succeed?